Hello, and thank you for attending my presentation today. My name is John Goulter. Throughout this, I will briefly outline the literature and the implications from the previous report this presentation is built on. I will discuss the data gathered from the students and the themes that have emerged. Finally, I will conclude with implications for music educators teaching in multicultural contexts and discuss the limitations and ways forward as this research project ends. Before I start my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm presenting from, which are the Woolgaroof of our people, and it's also surrounded by the Bindal country and people. These First Nations people have taken care of the land for 60,000 years, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging as the holders of knowledge and culture and the future of Indigenous Australia. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations people that have been essential in the development of this project. Alice Bintaho, Auntie Nerida, Auntie Gladys, Kathy Adams, Patsy Ann Saunders, and Merwes Wilber. Thank you. This project and this work is only possible because of your time, understanding, patience, and support. Deborah Cheetham described music for First Nations people as music is the way of knowing the world and giving meaning to everything in it. This aligns some way with Kodai's idea of using the mother tongue to teach music, as it contains aspects of culture not found or passed on anywhere else. Throughout this presentation, when I'll refer to students as non-Indigenous or Indigenous, and within the Indigenous category we have Torres Strait Islander students and Aboriginal students. The context this project took place in is an independent Catholic all-girls high school in North Queensland, Australia. It mainly caters to a middle socio-economic class of families, and we currently have 25% attendance of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander students in our whole school population. The majority of those students board at the school for the majority of the year. This has major implications for them as they are away from their families, permanent representations and comfortable expressions of their culture and their country. Within this 25%, 75% are Torres Strait Islander and 25% are Aboriginal. While there are some similarities in the surface culture, each island or community has their own specific deep culture, traditions, language and customs which may or may not be shared or understood by neighbouring communities and islands. In my first year at the school, I saw many disengaged Indigenous students in the music classroom. This prompted my research into Indigenous education. The biggest influence in this area came from Chris Sarah, who expresses the view that Indigenous students need positive representation of their own culture to develop their autonomy and engage them successfully in education. His views align with research emerging from the Central Queensland University, which looked at the resilience of Indigenous students. And these both align with the ideas of culturally responsive teaching and curriculum. My main idea was to use Indigenous music to engage my students and support reconciliation within my school. To support this idea of using culturally responsive materials to develop the curriculum and students' engagement, I utilized participatory action research and critical service learning as tools to engage with community groups. These have both been used successfully when non-Indigenous groups have engaged with Indigenous groups in university education. This also falls in line with Sean Wilson's research's ceremony thesis, which looks at how relationships are the most important aspect when working with Indigenous community groups. The research must always put the needs and the wants of the community first, not the researcher. The general implications outlined in my preliminary report suggested that researchers develop their cultural competency through musical and non-musical activities with stakeholders and community groups to build trust and rapport. In my context, this has led to a deepened understanding of Indigenous culture, development of relationships with local community groups, and sharing of music for use within the school context. There have been several different factors: sorry business, that's Indigenous funeral process, change of employment and change of some of our Indigenous contexts, residents, which have impacted building these relationships but has not influenced the student data presented today. The data was collected through a bespoke survey, which is administered at the end of 4 terms of Kodai-inspired music education. Year 7, ages 12 to 13 music classes in the years of 2019 to 2020 met 5 times a fortnight for a school year. School data shows that 25% of these students in each year level identified as being Indigenous and 75% of students identified as being non-Indigenous. Both years used similar repertoire from students' cultural backgrounds and were approved for classroom use by elders and communities. The quantitative data resulted from simple yes-no questions asking students for their ethnic backgrounds, preferences on cultural repertoire, or their engagement in class. Qualitative data resulted from open-ended questions such as why did you disagree or agree, and what role does this music play inside of your life outside of school. The data was analysed by the researcher and an independent analyst to assess data themes. As we go through the data from 2019 is on the left side of the screen, with data from 2020 being on the right side of the screen. Question 1 asks students to identify as either Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, both, or neither. As I've already said, we have 25% of students on our school records who identify as Indigenous, and 75% of them identify as Torres Strait Islander. We can see here that students who identify as Torres Strait Islanders actually come in lower in the in-class survey than students who identify as Aboriginal, which is not lining up with our school data. It's really surprising that this came in lower, because generally the Torres Strait Islander students are more extroverted and prouder of their culture than Aboriginal students. They generally wear more clothing from their culture, more flags, and share their stories more often than Aboriginal students. I think this could relate to 2 different factors why this data might appear this way. Torres Strait Islander students were not able to complete the questionnaire due to lack of access. They forgot their laptop or it wasn't charged, or they were away from class. Some teachers also did forget to administer the test to all the students, and so that would also have an impact on the data. The survey also used formal academic language, which may have been too much or too abstract for students in Year 7 who have English as a second or third language. Question 2 asked students if they enjoyed singing Indigenous Australian music. Generally, there was a positive response, with most students answering yes or sometimes. In 2019, 54% of students answered yes. Indigenous students in 2019 answered 65%, so a higher percentage than everyone together. In 2020, 75% of students answered yes, and then 75% of Indigenous students answered yes. There's an increase in each year from 2019 to 2020. And I think this is because of the teacher experience in teaching the Indigenous materials. In 2019, we had 4 different early career teachers teaching music to Year 7. These teachers came from a variety of backgrounds and may or may not have taught Indigenous repertoire before and known about cultural protocols. So with a year of experience and with some targeted professional development and relationship building with students, teachers may have matured and improved their approach to teaching Indigenous materials, thus resulting in increased enjoyment. The main tool to help teacher implementation of cultural materials is storytelling, specifically the context of the song and the background of it, and where the teacher came across it, who they learnt it from, and what was the story when that happened. The main researcher worked with community members to be given permission to use these songs, who then passed the songs on to other teachers. This handover of material may have lacked proper storytelling and cultural protocols essential in authentically passing on materials. To facilitate this and to improve this for all teachers in the program, elders and culture bearers were invited into the school to work with teachers and students, providing the opportunity to develop their own stories and relationships with these people. Question 3 asked students to explain their not really or no choices to question 2. 2019 students offered much more feedback than 2020 students. 3 main themes appeared from their short responses. There was a concern for language due to the difficulty and a perceived respect as they did not understand the words or they didn't understand the context. There was a general disinterest in repertoire due to lack of relevance, and students didn't believe that it was relevant for their own musical careers. And also some students wrote positive comments even though it was regarding the not really or no answers, and they said they enjoyed singing them. Question 4 asked students to vote for their favourite songs taught throughout the year. There was one change in repertoire from the 2 years, with Karakeveli being exchanged for Nala Bula Fela in 2020. This is because no one voted for Karakeveli in 2019, and students identified Nala Bula Fela throughout 2019 and indicated they enjoyed that song, and we decided to implement that. Songs you taught and used early in the year in terms 1 and 2, so that's Monkey and Turtle and Karakeveli and Nala Bula Fela, were voted for less than songs taught in terms 3 and 4. This may show that students are picking their favourite songs on songs they remember better more than the songs that were taught early in the year. Torres Strait Islander students preferred songs from their own background, with either Tabanaba or Monkey and Turtle receiving exclusive votes from them. Aboriginal students voted for both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander songs each year, with Monkey and Turtle being the favourite in 2019, a Torres Strait Islander song, and the Maranoa Lullaby being favourite in 2020. Tabanaba and Monkey and Turtle are both popular Torres Strait Islander songs with dance moves that appealed to the Torres Strait Islanders population at the school. Overall, Maranoa Lullaby was a favourite in 2020 and a close favourite in 2019. This song featured both English and Kolgai language, which might have appealed to non-Indigenous students. It also was the only task that we put onto the pianos. So the students would sing the song, they would learn to play it on an instrument, and then they would create a bass line. This may have reinforced that song in the students' mind as their favourite or just as the most prevalent. Question 5 asked students to reflect upon if these songs help them participate in class. The results are similar to question 2, with generally positive results, with yes and sometimes holding the majority. Indigenous students replied that 75% in 2019 and 90% in 2020 that yes, these songs help them participate in lessons. Only one Indigenous student throughout both years replied a blanket no in 2019 that these songs did not help them participate in class. Non-Indigenous students replied with more varied responses between yes, sometimes, and not really, but still the majority indicating yes, the songs helped them. There was a positive change from 53% in 2019 to 63% in 2020, which might have been explained as previously with the development of teacher facilities for teaching these songs. Question 6 asked students if they believe that the songs would be taught and used correctly in class. In 2019, the question was phrased this way: do you feel the Indigenous songs were used correctly? Which is a very broad interpretation of being used correctly. We changed this in 2020 to do you feel the Indigenous songs were being taught and used correctly? This may have had an impact on the data, as 2020 question drew direct attention to if the songs were taught and the teaching of the material compared to just being used correctly. Students, non-Indigenous students and Indigenous students may have different understandings and interpretations of what is correct, especially if the stories, the pronunciation or permissions are slightly off, or if the stories hadn't been shared with the class about why the teacher is teaching this or where they received the song from. Well, both years elicited a majority of positive responses, 59% in 2019 and 69% in 2020. There was a 10% increase, which could have been from the rephrasing of the question or the increased facility of teacher ability to teach these songs. 7% of the 2019 students answered not really, with those being 10% Indigenous students and 7% non-Indigenous. In 2020, the overall percentage for not really dropped to 2%, with all non-Indigenous students answering yes or sometimes, a positive response, and 25% of Indigenous students answering not really. Question 7 was a follow-up on any of the student answers from question 6 if they wished. Some of the interesting answers were, because you pronounced the words wrong. They were whitewashed and you don't teach us the meaning. Because some of us don't speak the language. Overused and musical notes, and I'll elaborate on that one. They may have been unhappy if teachers had abstracted the songs into solfa, time names, or notation and letter names. There should be an elder with us. because the other students are not Indigenous and do not really know what the song is saying. Because you keep saying it in English and I like it in language. And the last one was I didn't really know these were Indigenous songs. Themes again are there's an issue with language, incorrect teaching etiquette or not understanding where if the teachers have permission to teach these songs, lack of storytelling, and incorrect use of art through abstraction. All of these will be discussed later in the implications. Question 8 asks the students if they had a preference for more Indigenous music in the music program. The responses were majority yes, with 59% being in 2019 and 71% being in 2020. There was a 10% increase again. This is a common thing we're starting to see. And Indigenous students answered yes to this question at a higher percent than non-Indigenous students at 78.5% over the 2 years compared to 63% when you pull apart the data, showing more interest in representation of the culture. Depends on which songs was also a new question which students hadn't received yet, and it was the most voted for. It would have been interesting to see if that depends on which songs was removed, and it was a clear yes, no, or no opinion. Because students always think that maybe they get a choice in the songs and maybe they have a different interpretation of what Indigenous songs are compared to what they really are. Question 9 asks for an explanation of their answers to question 8, especially if they answered no or depends on which songs. The students who answered yes also appear to have answered these questions, so there's a mix of student responses in this question. Answers from this question included, because I'd like to see other songs from other cultures included in the music program. I don't mind, but I dislike singing since I feel like I'm disrespecting the culture. Some songs are nice to learn, but some are a bit hard. Sometimes it is a bit tricky doing the words, but some are harder to sing than others. Hard and boring because we can't understand what it means, because maybe some of us don't want to learn. So we can see some themes are students interested in more variety of songs in the program. There's a difficulty in singing in language. There's a lack of desire to learn different songs, and there's a perceived disrespect when singing in language. There are some overall trends we can see from all of these 10 questions. The 2019 cohort generally answered with less positive results while still being a majority positive. It is interesting to note that even with a smaller grade, the 2019 cohort opted to answer more open-ended questions than the 2020 cohort. This could be as they felt they wanted to have their feelings heard or wanted to see the program improve and believe they could do that with feedback. Overall, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students enjoyed singing the Indigenous songs presented in class and found the songs helped them engage in classroom music. Some overall themes which will be discussed soon is that there's students concerned about language, pronunciation, and perceived disrespect. Students also cared about knowing the meaning and the backgrounds to the songs and not singing something that they didn't know. And Indigenous students indicated they would like to learn and sing these songs with elders present. Some implications and ideas surrounding the teaching of this project and the teaching of Indigenous material. So these ideas have been derived from the data, my reflection with my teaching team, or my own experience working with community groups. So the first one is when choosing repertoire for your program. Consider the students' backgrounds. It is essential when choosing repertoire to consider the students' background. Understand that songs from one culture, even if similar on the surface, may not have any relevance for students from another culture or even another island close by. This can be true when presenting material from one Indigenous culture to another Indigenous culture. Once, when presenting an Aboriginal song, a Torres Strait Islander student stood up to me and said, "Why are we learning this? This isn't my song," as the student perceived it had no relevance to their education. This has also happened with non-Indigenous students. I generally meet these questions with a response similar to, before colonisation, before the British came, songs and language were shared between different cultural groups when they married or when they traded. Today, we are all living in one big culture together, and we need to understand different aspects of everyone's culture so we can learn to live well together. Well, this is a nice answer, and the students generally respond well to it. It is good to and it's essential to consider the background of your student and maybe attempt to cater your repertoire choices to them. This can be difficult when many students come from different backgrounds or there are no resources from that student's background. Using repertoire from film music or popular music artists from their backgrounds can help close that gap and develop rapport with students. Age and gender is also a large factor in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. There are certain songs that are only meant to be taught by certain people, to certain people, at certain times in their lives, and this is a traditional way of passing on knowledge. This also extends to genders, as there's much segregation between men and women's business and songs in aspects of Australian Indigenous culture. While it would be really rare for a non-initiated, so someone that hasn't worked with community groups, a non-Indigenous person, to happen upon and have these songs through research on the internet or through books, extreme care should be taken when materials are found. My advice is to use songs that you have been able to research yourself and checked with culture bearers or learned from culture bearers. We have to consider the needs of the desires of the students, the family, and the community groups, while, of course, juggling the curriculum. Combined with the first 2 points, it is important to see how these songs fit into the curriculum, the program, and the needs of the students. A song may have a great melodic phrase or rhythm we'd love to teach something from, but if it doesn't serve the needs of the community, the culture, or the students, then it probably shouldn't be used in that way. That leads me on to my next idea of abstraction. Must these songs be abstracted into solfa or rhythmic names and be notated? Does this damage the song in any way? Well, in some minds, it would be nice to freely abstract songs to show the shared musical elements between cultures. Abstraction to solfege, letter names, rhythmic names, or notation may alter the fundamental cultural essence of the song, which we may not understand. My general advice is not to abstract the songs into solfa, time names, or letter names, as we are unaware how this could affect the songs. I've worked with elders, and in my experience, elders are generally happy for songs to be notated depending on the repertoire. So when teaching repertoire, consider the elders and students as your teaching partners. Students in class who may know different versions of a song you're teaching can be affirmed and listened to by allowing them to teach the class if they are willing. In my experience, students are very keen to share their culture and do so with pride. I offer this advice for warning sometimes, as especially under pressure, students can actually perform songs in incorrect ways. For one example, our Torres Strait Islander students were asked to do a dance, and they prepared and performed a boys' dance, which females shouldn't be performing in their culture. The elders were present to watch them, and the students realized about halfway through the dance that the elders were there, and then became very nervous and very shy and almost stopped doing the dance. And the elders were quite angry at them, and we had to have a big chat with everyone. So we've got to make sure that work with the students and work with elders to make sure we're asking the correct things of the students. Elders as teaching partners is a great idea if you're able to do it, as the students generally love seeing these elders come in to share their stories and to share and to teach the songs authentically. Pronunciation and language has also been another issue, as we've seen through the data. If you're unable to have elders or proficient and culturally competent students deliver materials, which is honestly most of the time in a classroom setting, then it is best to work with culture bearers to develop your own ability to present material in culturally appropriate and correct ways. It can be sometimes weird if you're handing over to the student to help you with pronunciation, but opening up the classroom that way creates a culture of sharing within your classroom. It also helps to provide any translations or contextual information to the students, as it will help develop their understanding of the song as more than just a song I don't understand, as a song that I understand and there's a story to it. Always include stories and permissions where you learned the songs from. Many beginning teachers hear the advice to try and connect with their students through appropriate personal stories that relate to the curriculum. This is a great opportunity to do so. Indigenous songs learn at home through stories from generally older people. By showing this and showing how you learned the song, I went to work with Merwa as well, but she taught me this song. She said it's okay to teach to you. let's have a sing. The students see the same cultural protocols used in their home environment in the school context. Therefore, you're affirming how they learn and saying this is important for you to understand that I've gone out and done my homework to be able to do this song with you. This really goes a long way in developing rapport with Indigenous students, which is the first step, in my opinion, necessary to be able to teach them. The next implication is the teacher ability, which we've discussed a little bit earlier. So teaching Indigenous cultural materials, singing in different languages, and discussion of colonisation can be difficult and confrontational for some teachers, depending on their backgrounds. It is important to provide professional development from culture bearers to improve teacher knowledge of Indigenous music culture and their ability to teach Indigenous students through direct experience with culture bearers. Peer training sessions can also be helpful to help teachers develop their understanding and a singing-based approach and its benefits, but the best thing is to get the culture bearers and the elders in to work with the teachers. The last implication, this is less of an implication but more of an overarching idea that's happened that I've seen, which isn't necessarily represented through the data, is that as you implement these songs in your program, there will be a development and a change in the school culture. In my context, through doing this, students have started to more freely share songs they might want to do, or share songs and dances they want to do in assembly. We now have a cultural dance group for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups, which is something we couldn't have dreamed of about 4 years ago. And students are openly sharing their culture and coming up to teachers saying, "Hey sir, hey miss, I'd like to share this song with you so we can do it. Can we do it here? Where can we do it?" Some of the limitations, there have been some limitations within the project. There have been loss of elders through relocation to different towns and community groups, or death of a main elder, which has been sad, and we haven't been able to continue working with them and develop that relationship. COVID-19 has played a large part in our ability to invite elders in to teach students. It has also changed the way we taught our repertoire in Term 2 of 2020. We taught all of that term online, so that changed a lot. That could have affected the student responses. The survey design asked Year 7 students, 12 and 13-year-olds, to reflect quite deeply about their experiences, and that some students may not have had those reflective capabilities, which may have affected the results. The students also had to read quite academic language if they haven't come across this language before, and some students have English as their second or third language, which may have affected their understanding of the questions. The whole cohort response was missing for both years. About 75% of the students for both years overall were successfully surveyed, so about 25% of answers students weren't. So that definitely would be interesting to know their remaining opinions. And as I've already said, teacher ability may have affected, and we've seen that in the 2019 to 2020 data. So going forward from here, I aim to continue to develop rapport and relationships with the community groups and elders and families if possible. Continue research into Indigenous ways of knowing and incorporate this into teaching strategies when delivering Indigenous curriculum, and investigate other methodologies used when attempting to use cultural materials in educational settings. As you can see, there's much to consider when deciding to use and teach different cultural materials in a music program. My main tip is to build relationships with the students, the families, and the community groups you are wishing to help with your ideas. Find out what they want and find out what they need to see if you can help them. Thank you for attending my presentation today. Please ask me any questions or send me through any questions, and I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.